Good afternoon. In this talk I'd like to speak a bit about the history of the British tradition of freedom of conscience and religion, and how this may be impacted by the current debate over Islamophobia. As you may or may not know, the Labour government is currently considering passing a law against Islamophobia to protect Muslims from discrimination and persecution. Now, there's already been a debate about it in Parliament, which I think yesterday, and there's already been an attempt to define Islamophobia, which has been adopted by all the parties, except with the exception of the Tories, and it's been adopted by a number of Labour councils, and not just Labour councils. Now, this has been criticised by some Christian organisations because it talks in very vague terms and also includes something about Muslims being persecuted for their Muslimness. Now, the worry with this definition of Islamophobia is that it doesn't distinguish between criticism of the religion, which should be perfectly acceptable and allowed under freedom of conscience, and persecution of Muslims simply for being Muslims. Now, you have to protect individuals from abuse and discrimination, but I strongly believe all ideologies, philosophies and religions should be up for rational debate and criticism. Now, part of the problem is that traditional Islam does not have a concept of a secular state. There is no separation, or there was no separation of mosque and state until, I think, Atatürk's regime in Turkey. What you will find from reading some Muslim advocates is that they will say that Muslims actually demand that the state support religion. Now, I have no objection to the state supporting Muslim schools in the same way that the state supports Christian and Jewish schools and presumably other, those schools of other faiths, if there are any. Right? No problem. I've no issue with that. However, this issue becomes dangerous because many Muslim states have blasphemy laws which criminalised apostasy, conversion away from Islam, and blasphemy. Under Pakistani law, blasphemy is punishable by death. There are about 200 people in prison currently on death row for blasphemy. And this is what the fear is that any attempt that the definition of Islamophobia will act in effect as a blasphemy law. So that if someone says that, says something derogatory about Islam or Allah, they will be imprisoned. Under the guise of Islamophobia, but really because they blasphemed against Islam. Now, the calls for freedom of conscience in the British tradition start in the 16th century with the Reformation, and the Puritans particularly calling for freedom of religion in the face of I think Henry VIII's Reformation, which for many people didn't go far enough, and then in the reign of Queen Mary and so on, it becomes particularly clear in the 17th century during the British Civil War. And it draws not only on the Bible, but also the works of early Christian apologists like Lactantius. Now, Lactantius was living through the Roman persecution in perhaps, I think, the 2nd or the 3rd century. And one of the things he wrote was that persecution will not convert anyone. It will only instill fear. Now, these early Christian calls for freedom of conscience were taken up by people like William Penn and John Fox in the Quakers, also other radical Protestants. And one of the most radical calls for freedom of conscience was arguing not just for freedom of belief for Protestant Christians of various sects, but it also included Jews and Turks. Turks at this time would have been synonymous with Muslims. There was an element of utilitarianism in it, in that the author of that pamphlet believed that if Jews were given freedom of conscience, they would be more likely to convert to Christianity. But it's still important nonetheless. It's still a demand for very, very radical toleration at a time when there were state churches and there were strict limits given to what you could officially believe. Now, these start crumbling. The last execution, I'm sorry about that, for atheism was in the 1680s. Now that's obviously one too many, but even so, people haven't been executed for atheism in Britain for, was it 400 years or more? Or so? Atheism was still illegal, but in practice, what this meant was that you were debarred from political serving as a politician on councils and so on, which many councils disregarded. I mean, there was a complaint about Bristol City Corporation in the 1820s that horror of horrors, it included all sorts, including Jews and I think people who definitely did not go to church. So. And then I think the prohibition against atheism in Britain became, I think, a dead letter with the election of Bradlaugh in the 19th century, who was an atheist. But he was nevertheless elected to Parliament. The last proper prosecution for blasphemy in Britain was brought by Mary Whitehouse in the 1970s against gay news for a poem they published about Christ. And this ended up, according to Mary Whitehouse herself, who was a notorious moral crusader, particularly when it came to Doctor Who, with a crowd of gays marching around waving placards and denouncing her in her garden, which must have been a surprising spectacle. But that's it. There have been calls from the Muslims community for a blasphemy law to protect Islam since the 1987 publication of Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. Now, I think these calls for blasphemy have to be rejected. I think anybody shouting that somebody ought to be murdered because they disrespected any kind of anyone's religion should be prosecuted themselves. I know this contradicts free speech, but we have to protect freedom of speech. I think this should be non-negotiable. And I think more people should know and read up on the history and arguments of free speech and freedom of conscience in this country. I mean, I think the best known articulation of the arguments for freedom of speech are probably in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which used to be given to every new leader of the Liberal Party. I don't know if it is now, but I'm very, very much aware that there is a rising climate of Islamophobia, and that in the riots a few weeks ago we had thugs trying to attack mosques and their worshippers. Now, clearly you have to protect people, and Muslims or anybody who is being faced with persecution and mass attack like that, you have to. But you should allow freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom to worship whoever or whatever you want, and freedom not to have to worship or join a religion or ideology you do not agree with. That has to be protected. Now, many of the pamphlets from the time of the English Civil War, which laid the basis of current British civil liberties and freedoms, are in the Penguin Classics volume Divine Right and Democracy, which was published by Penguin Press. I can't remember now offhand who edited it, but it contains a number of very important documents outlining the debate in the 17th century over the English Constitution, the power and roles of the king, the nature of the state, and issues of freedom of conscience. One of the key planks in British freedom is that the judge can't overrule the jury, or at least couldn't. It was after William Penn and one of his fellow Quakers were imprisoned in Bristol, and there was a charge brought up against them for preaching, because they were Protestant nonconformists, and their views contradicted those of the established church. So they were imprisoned. They were brought to trial on a charge of blasphemy or seditious preaching or whatever. And the jury kept on finding them not guilty, despite the judge ordering to find them guilty. And this led to the legal and this led to British judges not being able to overrule the findings of a jury in similar cases again. And there are other cases, such as the Levellers, who were early Democrats, and where they were imprisoned or impeached, and they also were arguing for something like, they were arguing for democracy, which at that time meant every male head of the family should have the vote, which isn't terribly democratic by today's standards, but very, very radical in the 17th century, when really political power is held by the aristocracy and the gentry. Few people are in the middle classes, but no one else, right? We have to protect this. Freedom of speech and conscience and religion affects and protects everyone, not just Christians, but also Jews and Turks. Because if you can start encroaching on one section of the community's freedom of belief, the power is there to stamp on others. So, I wish people would read up more on this. I am alarmed at the way Labour is going about it. They said, I think Angela Rayner said that she would be taking advice on Islamophobia. I would like to know who is giving that advice. And I believe that we should still. We need to protect Muslims. We need to protect other people in our communities who may also suffer abuse and persecution. But we need to maintain the right of freedom of religion and also freedom from religion. Thank you very much.